Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. I'm very pleased to be in a room with many people whose work I've read and admired for many years. And so this morning I looked at the title of my presentation and realized that it was so impossibly broad that I should narrow it down at least a tiny bit. So I am going to focus on what political science can tell us about oil and democracy. Now, just to clarify, just as some of you study currency systems, I study types of government, and just as you know that there is no single best type of currency system, different systems are perhaps more suitable for different countries, I have the same views about democracy and other types of governments. Okay? This is simply alternative kinds of government. This is not about good government versus bad government. That's a different conversation, but about governments that are elected, are chosen through competitive elections versus governments that are under some other kind of system. So part of the inspiration for my focus comes from this tremendously interesting and important essay written 45 years ago by Hossein Mahdavy. The Patterns and Problems of Economic Development in Rentier States arguably was the first piece of scholarship that focused our attention on the issues of rentier states and ultimately gave birth to the vast literature that we're all familiar with on both the economic problems and the political problems of resource-rich countries. And just to give you a sense of its growing importance, in the first few decades after it was published, you can see it was barely cited. This is a bar chart showing citations, new citations, for each 5-year period since it was published. And in the last 15 years, interest in this article has grown exponentially. What did it say that was so important? It is a very rich essay, and each time I go back to it, I'm struck by its freshness and relevance, even though it was written at a time when we had not seen any oil shocks, for a world that was drastically different than today, and yet its repercussions are still with us, and I will argue are even more important today than they were back in 1970. Mahdavy revived the concept of the rentier state, which had been developed earlier in the 20th century, but had sort of fallen into disuse. And he helped us understand how a government's reliance on external rents can shape both its economic policies and the quality of its governance. He argued that when countries discover oil, government spending comes to dominate the economy, something that's self-evident to those of us in the room now, but at the time I think was rarely commented on. Importantly, he pointed out that this occurs without the government having to resort to taxation. So the government is spending but not taxing. It plays this dominant role in the economy, and yet it does not have to turn to citizens to try to collect taxes. And this leads to a breakdown in accountability, he argued. So as a result, in his argument, oil led to governments that tended to neglect development because the leaders were not bound to listen to the people and to follow their best interests. Now, this at the time may have been true, I'm not sure it is today, but there were two main implications. One, he said, is that oil and rentier states would suffer from economic and technological backwardness, and two, that they would suffer from socio-political stagnation. And each of those claims at the time, I think, has led to a vast literature on the economic implications, the Dutch disease, the resource curse, and the political implications of oil discoveries and natural resource dependence. Now, as a political scientist, I'm going to focus on this question of socio-political stagnation. in my view, this was the most important legacy of this article. As you heard yesterday, there's significant difference of opinion, not terribly clear whether there is a economic resource curse in the sort of classic Jeffrey Sachs argument, but I think there's very strong evidence of a kind of political resource curse. What do I mean by that? There's now quite a bit of research on the effects of oil wealth on many, many different dimensions of political life, including government accountability, which I'll say more about in a moment, the effects of oil rents in reducing press freedom and transparency, the effects on corruption, the conditions under which we observe more corruption or less corruption in oil-rich countries, the incidence of violent conflict. And the frontier of this literature in the last 5 years, I think, has moved from cross-national studies and time series analysis of countries to subnational studies, where scholars have looked at Brazil, Iran, Indonesia, Peru, China, United States, and compared provinces or municipalities with resource wealth to similar ones without, and found the same kinds of political dynamics, the same kinds of problems typically at the subnational level that we observe at the cross-national level. So this has given, I think, scholars in this area a lot more confidence that we're not simply observing the sort of spurious correlations that we sometimes see with the cross-national analysis. There really is an important effect. So what are some of the key insights of this literature? I'm going to focus on the relationship between oil and democratic governance, okay? And with a special eye towards getting to the ultimate question of what happens when oil prices drop. Okay? But first, a couple of broad patterns. Now, there is extensive econometric work in this area, some I've published, vast amount published by others. That's all available to you in the comfort of your own homes. But today I thought I would just focus on sort of very straightforward patterns that can just simply be seen by eyeballing the data. And one of those patterns is that the effects of oil on democracy have actually grown since the 1970s. That is, for the keenness of Mahdavyy's insight in 1970, there wasn't that much difference at the time in political accountability between oil-rich and non-oil countries. But today there is, and the difference is quite large. Here's one way to measure it. So I have here a figure that covers the period from 1945 to about 2006. And on the vertical axis, I have the polity scale, that is a scale that political scientists have developed that ranks all countries by the level of democratic accountability or democratic institutions. Higher the number, more democratic; the lower, the less democratic. And I've broken out the major oil producers, the countries that in 1960 were oil producers and today are still oil producers, from all other states, and just simply looked at the median democracy score, the median polity score of these two groups of countries. In 1970, where the red arrow or red arrows are pointing, you can see there was actually not much difference. You can control for many other things. There's still not a terribly clear difference. It's only in the 1980s when we see waves of democratization in Latin America, Southern Europe, East Asia, ultimately in the 90s, the fall of the Soviet Union, democratization in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, that these two lines diverge. There's a profound difference today in democracy scores between oil producers and non-oil producers, but it's not because oil producers have become less democratic. If anything, they are somewhat more democratic on average than they were 30 or 40 years ago. But it's because the rest of the world has become significantly more democratic. A second insight is that this pattern holds true across regions. That is, you might think that when I say oil-rich countries, I'm just using code words for the Middle East region, and I'm not. And one way to see this, again, this is, clear in the econometrics. You can control for Middle East region. You can throw out all the observations of the Middle East, but you can also do something just simpler and look at the countries that are, according to this ranking, Freedom House, are the countries with the least, the lowest levels of democracy today. Okay, these are the 17 countries that have the lowest scores. And you can see actually most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, but also Middle East, East Asia, a little bit in Latin America and Central Asia. About half of these are oil-producing countries. Okay. There is this significant association across regions between a country's oil endowment and the lack of political freedom. A third interesting pattern that comes from several important papers is that this holds not merely for the type of government, that is the regime, the democratic system or the undemocratic system, but it also holds for individual leaders. That is, individual leaders, those who happen to be incumbents when oil production rises or is at a high level, tend to endure in office much longer. Okay? These regimes are more enduring. Some say they are more stable. And again, it comes from a statistical analysis, but you can just eyeball the broad patterns and see the longest serving leaders in the world today are two leaders of oil-rich African countries. Before them, you could look at the leaders of Gabon and Libya, okay, who had been in power many, many decades. Okay. A fourth interesting pattern is that we see transitions toward democratic rule, transitions away from one-party states, away from military rule, when oil prices drop, at least in some cases. Let's look at a few examples. So one of the most important examples, in fact, the country with the most oil wealth that has democratized in the past 5 decades, is Mexico. Mexico transitioned to democracy around 1999-2000, but after a period when, as you well know, there had been about 15 years of quite low prices and, in fact, declining production in Mexico. Okay? Arguably, this weakened the patronage resources of the ruling party, the PRI, and opened the door towards greater democratic competitiveness in the elections. Not too different in Nigeria, which also transitioned away from military rule, took the first major steps towards civilian rule and ultimately democratic rule right about at the same time. Again, when oil prices were at this low point, the lowest they had been, I believe, since the early 1970s. And similarly in Indonesia, okay, a country that had declining production of natural gas at the time, and again was marked by a decreasing reliance on this resource, which arguably depleted the patronage resources, the resources available to the Suharto government, and weakened its grip on the political system. Now, not all transitions away from one type of regime necessarily lead to another type of regime. Just because you're transiting out of one-party rule does not mean that you necessarily are transiting to democracy. Another important transition occurred, of course, in the country that is today Russia, when the Soviet Union fell in the early 1990s for, of course, many, many reasons, but it cannot be coincidental, in my view, that the government, which did rely so heavily on its oil resources for hard currency, faced a tremendous crisis, depletion of its reserves, again, very, very low prices, bankrupting the government and causing the breakdown not just of the Soviet state, but of, to a large degree, law and order in the whole region for some years. So this is a pattern that we do see. Notice that it is often after not 1 or 2 years of low oil prices, but in these cases, at least a decade of low oil prices, and in some cases also declining production. This doesn't mean that we do not see successful transitions to democracy in many cases, but those happen to be in countries without oil. Okay? So look just, for example, at a dozen or so Muslim countries that have transitioned to democracy in the past few decades, most recently Tunisia. These were countries that, by and large, had little or almost no oil resources. Okay? Somehow, there are many ingredients that go into a successful transition to democracy, that is one that is sustainable, one in which you are able to have stability and multiple elections with peaceful transitions of power. But we simply have not observed these kinds of transitions in many places where there's more than a little bit of oil. So the question that might occur to some of you is, what about in the high-rent oil exporters? What about in the countries with really very large per capita oil wealth? What do we see in these cases? And the honest answer is we don't know, because there really is no precedent for transitions in countries whose oil wealth passes a certain threshold. Now let me show you some data on this. I've looked here at all, I think it's about 110 countries that in 1960 were undemocratic. They were under one form of authoritarian rule or another. Some of these countries over the last 50, 55 years have transitioned to democracy, some have not. And to measure how much time they've spent under democracy, I've created this variable it's on the vertical axis that just tells us how much of its life since 1960 this country has been under democratic rule. If you're Turkey or the Dominican Republic or Spain and Portugal, you've spent most of your life over this span of time as a democracy. If you're down at the bottom, the zeros, you've not made this transition before. On the horizontal axis, you can see I have oil income per capita. It's a log scale. And on the right end of the vertical axis, the horizontal axis, you can see all the countries that we might think of as high-rent oil exporters. Most in the Middle East, but not all. We have Gabon and Brunei and Russia, as well as states from the Arabian Gulf, from North Africa. You can see that beyond a certain threshold, defined more or less by the per capita oil wealth of Mexico, we have simply never witnessed a transition out of that regime into something democratic. So I can speculate just as well as you can speculate about what might happen in a low price environment or an environment of declining production, but it's not something that we have data on that we can analyze empirically because it is a phenomenon we have not yet witnessed. Okay, let me just recap a few of the main points. So I've tried to suggest that the most important legacy of this critical Mahdavy essay was its insights into political competitiveness and the effects of oil rents on a government's accountability. The fact that governments, when they do not need to collect taxes, seem to become less accountable to their citizens. I've suggested that this effect has grown over time. It was ironically not such a big deal at the time Mahdavy was writing, or perhaps he had an insight that was more subtle than what we can capture with these sort of crude figures. But today we see this very large gap between oil producers and non-oil producers in our best measures of accountability. We do see that transitions have occurred when oil rents drop, when production falls after a period of low oil prices. But this has largely occurred in what we might think of as sort of middle-range exporters or relatively small exporters. The Indonesia, Nigeria, which on a per capita basis is actually not terribly oil-rich. When it comes to the countries with truly profound levels of oil wealth, on a per capita basis, we simply do not have a record to predict what will happen in the new low-price environment. Thank you.